Hello everyone and welcome to this optimized Dante build guide. This build guide was requested by Saint Thomas 8371. This is not going to be a beginner Dante guide, so if you're unfamiliar with Dante's abilities, I recommend you first go and watch a video by any of the popular YouTubers. I'm sure they've all done a basic Dante guide. This is instead going to be a discussion of how you should actually build him around content and how you should optimize him. And I'll be justifying my positions on why I've optimized him the way I have. Without further ado, the first thing you might immediately notice is I have 5 casting speed shards on Dante. Now, outside of obviously Dante's abilities usually cast quite slowly, and being able to do his ability repetitions quickly, get all your buff timers back up, will give him a lot more time to play the game. Casting speed shards are also, well, they can be, an actual DPS increase for Dante. And to showcase that, I'll just spawn a Scourger Decadent here. So if I were to press 3 slowly, and then press 3 again, and then press 4, you'll see that I get 386,000 damage, right? And that's me simulating the slower casting speed, because obviously I'm not going to just remove my shards for this demonstration. Whereas, if I were to instead cast them as fast as this build can, you'll see I get 694,000 damage. And there's a reason for that. That's because what Tragedy does is it compresses all of the dots into a single instance, all of the dots, the dot ticks that haven't been done yet, and then multiplies them by, well, with this build, 8.94. Before I have external buffs. So every second that the dot is ticking, you're essentially leaking damage. So by having a copious amount of casting speed, like this build does, you'll see I can actually get my 3-3-4 off, that ability rotation off, before it even leaks one tick of damage. See? Like, there's not even one slash tick. So all of the dot gets compressed and multiplied by 8.94 times. So casting speed is not just a convenience and a time-saving thing on Dante. It can actually increase your damage, and that's something that I think gets overlooked. People tend to spend at least 1 or 2 shard slots on strength, because Dante does also love strength, but you should absolutely be using 5 casting speed shards in my opinion, so that you don't leak any damage on your Tragedy nukes. Also, just because it makes your ability rotations less cumbersome. The next thing, I do subsume off Noctua on basically all of my Dante configs that I mainly use, and that's because, well, first of all, Noctua is just flat out a weaker weapon than most incarnates, right? So why would you want to be spending energy per shot on a weaker weapon when you can spend no resources on a stronger weapon? Obviously, if you want to keep Noctua just because you feel like that's part of Dante's gameplay identity, you're more than welcome to do so, but as I'll discuss, Noctua is not completely going to waste on this build, and this is how I feel is most certainly the optimal way to build him, because Raw is coded as a faction damage increase. Now, faction damage increases notoriously double dip on damage over time effects, of which Dante is heavily anchored towards, right? He has his Dark Verse nukes which apply slash, he has his Tragedy which is all about compressing damage over time effects, and also Page Flight. Page Flight applies status damage and status chance vulnerability, right? So Dante is all about having copious levels of status, copious status damage, and then blowing enemies up by compressing and multiplying it finally with Tragedy. So Raw will double dip on Dark Verse, and then it will dip a third time on the Tragedy damage instance, the one that compresses all of the damage into that one tick and multiplies it. Raw will dip again here. So if you have, say, a 100% Raw, which is double damage, because you're already doing 100%, so another 100% makes it double damage. If you dip 100% damage once, you get double damage. When you dip it again, because this is a dot ability, that'll be 4x damage. And when you dip it again on Tragedy, you're doing 8x damage, and that's before Tragedy's own 9x damage multiplier, before all these strength buffs and such. So all of that multiplying together makes Dante absolutely blow up enemies by compressing dots, right? That's really what Dante is amazing at. He's not the the best buffer of upfront damage weapons. That would probably be someone like Mirage, but Dante specializes in buffing up dot-based weapons especially, and compressing dots in general. So Raw, it complements his kit so well. Your strength, by adding Raw into this build, your dots are essentially dipping your strength stat up to about like 8 times when you account for the double dips they deal, the double dips on status chance and status damage as well, and the multiplication from tragedy and the Raw dipping again on the tragedy. It's just absurd. Raw on Dante is just by far the best option. He feels like he was catered to exploit Raw. So that's my justification for using Raw in this build. I've weighed him heavily towards strength because all of his abilities really benefit the most from strength, I would say. His buffs already have very long durations. They already have, for instance, 57 seconds with this build at 128 duration, so about a minute's duration. And 145 range. Positive range is still helpful, and that makes your Dark Fur supply 29 meter damage and makes your buffs 43 meters, so you can easily buff your entire team quite easily. And Raw, of course, benefits partially from all of those things, and I do believe strength is the way to go on Dante, but I don't think that's a controversial opinion. I'm using Arcane Impetus on Dante, and I'll explain how that synergy comes into play when I talk more about Noctua. Arcane Steadfast is, I think, the biggest energy saving arcane or energy economy arcane you can use on Dante, specifically because Dante's abilities tend to be casted in groups of 3, which is just perfect, right, for Arcane Steadfast, because on ability cast, 20% chance that the next 3 abilities will not cost energy, right? Well, Dante tends to be pressing 2 or 3 and then finally like a 4, you know? So you can proc Steadfast with one of these 38 cost abilities, and then you can be getting a free cast of this 77.5 energy ability. So I do believe this is a better slot than something like Arcane Energize. We're using Archon Stretch, which I will talk about more as well when we go into Noctua, and Energy Nexus for more energy regen. Equilibrium as well, because health orbs already give, 50 health as opposed to a 25 energy orb, so turning that into energy basically means your health orbs are going to be twice as valuable energy orbs as energy orbs are. This is just a very good energy economy mod, especially with some companion synergies that we'll be talking about later. Firewalker, I'm using this because this Dante build is what I tend to bring to content where I have to move around a little, like Void Cascade or Disruption. More tough content like that, it's important, but you can get between Exilizers or Disruption Towers quicker. I do believe Firewalker is just a more important slot than anything else that could go here, really. The only other things you could consider are like 15% range or damage, or strength, sorry, from Cunning Drift or Power Drift. I do believe Firewalker just adds more value by merit of a speed increase. Also, this has some synergy with another thing that I'm going to talk about with Noctua in a moment. And Growing Power, I'm really mainly using this just because Dante appreciates strength so much. I do have configs for Mecha and Summoner's Wrath. The Summoner's Wrath config is the same, except I also use Coaction Drift as well. And this is when I want to heavily lean into the companion buffing side of things, because, as we've discussed, Dante is all about buffing status and dots, and companions tend to be about dot nuking. So Dante is one of the best frames for making your companions do copious amounts of damage with their Contagious Bond nukes and their Mecha Set nukes. So Dante is a very good pet buffer. Summoner's Wrath is good, but the reason why I mainly don't use it is twofold. Sometimes I just want to be doing the damage myself, in which case Summoner's Wrath isn't benefiting me at all. And also, Summoner's Wrath is coded as a faction damage increase, which Raw is already a faction damage increase. So by having both of these together, it slightly does diminish the value of having Summoner's Wrath. The Mecha Set, of course, this is for when you're using a Mecha nuking dog, specifically. Now it comes to talking about Noctua. So, as you'll recall, I've subsumed Noctua off, but that doesn't mean Noctua can't be of huge benefit to our build still, because Dante has this neat little ability called Word Warden, where he summons a copy of Noctua, which accompanies you and your ally's side. And even while Noctua is subsumed off, this will inherit the mods you put onto here. Importantly, Word Warden cannot inherit a few stats, so multi-shot and fire rate are two notable things that would be great to have, but actually they don't affect Word Warden at all. Word Warden can't fire multiple shots or fire any faster than its base speed, so there's no reason to put a fire rate mod on here. It also means that there's no negative to having Creeping Bullseye, because this is a negative fire rate increase, and Word Warden will completely not care about that because its fire rate is static. So this is just a huge crit chance increase, you might as well take that. It's time to start talking about some of the synergies with the main build config. Secondary Encumber can apply every status in the game via Word Warden, and that allows you to get all 13 stacks of Arcane Impetus. In fact, it allows every ally in your team to get 13 stacks of Arcane Impetus if you tell them, if you have a pre-made squad and you tell them, hey, I'm going to run Dante, you should put on Arcane Impetus. And of course, Arcane Impetus is considerably better than things like Multi-Augmented. This is, at full stacks, this is 12% more strength than a full augmented, and an entirely free 36% ability efficiency. So you might as well tell your squad mates to slot Impetus on if you're going to run this Dante config for them with Secondary Encumber. This also allows you to just have a book that will float by your side and automatically prime enemies for every single element in the game as you're just firing your main weapon at them. So you don't even need to swap to a primer really, you can just fire your main weapon at them and Word Warden slowly over time get every single status onto them. It's modded for electric, and that means it will consistently apply Archon Stretch, because of course Archon Stretch's its requirement is that you have an ability that deals electric damage. So Word Warden will be your ability that deals electric damage if you mod it for electric. It's also modded for Blast, and what modding for Blast does is it enables Word Warden to reproc itself, because blast ticks are coded weirdly in this game, and it's whenever the blast tick pops, Word Warden will re-aim at it, whereas it wouldn't re-aim at other damage over time effects. So you can just shoot once, and then Word Warden will basically keep perpetually firing as long as it keeps applying a couple blast procs to that enemy, which is very good, allows you to be very lazy. I also just have Augur Seeker on here so that the statuses last longer, and you get a small shield gating effect. Not that Dante needs that, of course, because Triumph gives him basic immortality. Amalgam Barrel Diffusion. This dodge speed, the multi-shot of this ability, like I've said, doesn't do anything because multi-shot doesn't do anything for Word Warden, but the dodge speed does apply twice in your loadout. So if you have the Epitaph with Amalgam Barrel Diffusion and this with Amalgam Barrel Diffusion, you can actually really fly very far per roll, as you can see. This is very good for getting around Exolizers and Void Cascade. You can go very far very quickly in one roll, and it also solves the complaint some people have about Dante, that his dodge animation seems to take longer to complete, because of course you're making it copiously fast. And you can really fly forward even more than a bullet jump would take you. And of course rolls are affected by parkour velocity, so that's part of the justification for using Firewalker on this main build. I am using crit mods just because against fodder enemies, Word Warden can just outright kill them, even some of the fodder enemies at level cap, the butchers. So all you have to do is really spam the Epitaph to the ground, and Word Warden will target them and just kill them instantly. Allows you to be very lazy. Talking about Dante's weapons, as Dante is a copious status damage buffer, some of the best weapons you can use with him are beam weapons, because beam weapons are also incredibly powerful with damage over time effects. And this is because multi-shot actually dips status damage on dots twice, right? And that's because of how multi-shot is coded to work for beam weapons. So this all happened in about 2017, 2018, when the beam weapon changes came around. They couldn't have multi-shot literally creating more beams for beam weapons because it would be so many ticks that they were unreadable, right? So what they instead did was they made multi-shot a damage multiplier, like literally just a damage increase for beam weapons. And what that did was it made dots behave the same, but it made non-damaging status types weaker, right? So a beam weapon would have a weaker application of, say, viral and corrosive, because they don't care about the damage increase, so the damage multiplier isn't doing anything for them. But what it would do is make it so that there are less ticks because you're not actually adding a second tick, which could proc that viral or that corrosive proc. Right. So what they ended up doing in the end, and this is how multi-shot works on beam weapons to this day, is multi-shot is both a damage multiplier per tick from the main beam, and it is a multiplier of the status per tick of damage. So what that means is, for dots, which care about both the damage increase and they care about how many status procs you're getting per tick, you're essentially double dipping the multi-shot stat, because you're applying, you know, I don't know, maybe twice as many ticks, but also the ticks are twice as big. And all this is because they didn't want to actually have beam weapons fire multiple beams, because that would be a visual clutter. So multi-shot is incredibly good on dot beam weapons, and Dante is all about buffing dots. Beam weapons are the best weapons to apply dots with, so the obvious picks for Dante's weapons are going to be dot applying beam weapons. And some of the best options of this include the Convectrix, which applies a copious amount of status procs. If I just demonstrate this first against a Scaldra Decadent. So, a Scaldra Decadent at level 215, just for those of you who don't know, has about 26 million EHP. 26 million EHP is about a quarter of the EHP of a level cap frac Centurion. So this guy is about a quarter as tanky as a level cap frac Centurion, so if we can completely obliterate him, you'll have a pretty good idea of how you would fare in a level cap run on Void Cascade. So just for Convectrix by itself, you'll see the way it fires. It converges and then it applies hundreds of status procs, even 1,000 status procs in a very short amount of time. And all that is, of course, without any of these benefits being stacked up. Never mind all of the buffs of Dante's kit. Right. Other good options include the Spectra Vandal, which is essentially a secondary Convectrix, and also the Phantasma, which you can mod for heat, and then you can compress all of those dots. But a weapon which I tend to use most of the time is just the Torrid Incarnate. And I do have a specific config for Dante, and I'll explain why I'm using Galvanized Aptitude on it a bit later. The Torrid does have base Toxin, which you have to do something about if you want to mod it for heat, so I turn it into Viral, which is not ideal for a dot applying beam weapon, because you would rather not have a status like Viral or Corrosive or something on a dot applying beam weapon, because what will happen is you will very quickly get to 10 viral procs, and then all subsequent procs that are viral are essentially wasted, and you would rather have just, you know, copious amounts of heat procs, like how the Convectrix was modded for only slash, and then you saw how many slash procs that just did. So this will not apply as many heat procs as quickly as something like the Convectrix, but the Torrid stats are generally better. Of course, you can get some pretty silly numbers like 200% crit chance and 11x multiplier. And of course the Torrid is just a more convenient weapon to use in general for blowing up entire rooms. So this tends to be the weapon I just use with Dante. If you want to lean very heavily into blowing people up with a big compressed dot and you want to see damage cap, I would recommend you use the Convectrix. But for merely the purposes of a level cap frax, the Torrid can do a fine job, and it's more convenient to use. The Epitaph config I use is deliberately modded not to have heat on it. So I have it coded as not heat inherit encumber viral, as you can see along the top here. The reason why we don't want heat on this Epitaph is because our heat source is generally going to be coming from either our companion, pet, or our sentinel, right? And we don't want a negative heat inherit situation, right? So if I were to have, say, just Scorch on here instead of electricity, I would get heat damage, and my heat elemental modifier is only 60% here. So if the first heat proc an enemy receives is from this, all subsequent heat procs will be applied as though they have a mere 60% heat elemental modifier to them, which means if I have a higher heat elemental modifier on an external source, that would be a negative heat inherit situation. right? You don't want a negative heat inherit, because that will weaken your heat procs overall. And as we can see, if we have a look at, say, one of the dogs, they have access to some of the highest elemental modifiers. In fact, I'm currently using an electric build. They have access to some of the highest elemental modifiers you'll ever find. They have 330%, as well as they can equip another mod. I do have a Radon Claws instead currently, but they could equip Flame Gland and get a 3.9x elemental modifier. So you would not want to turn that into a 60x with a negative heat inherit by applying your first heat proc with a silly epitaph, right? You wouldn't want that. Heat inherit can be a good thing as well as a bad thing if you apply your first heat procs with a bad source of elemental modifier. I just use the Praedos as my melee weapon as a movement stick. The only real important things here are the movement evolutions. Now, I'll talk about the focus school actually. So the obvious choice is Madurai, because this is 50% casting speed, which, as I've talked about, Dante loves. This is 40% strength, which Dante absolutely loves. And in general, Madurai's contamination wave, power transfer, and all these other abilities make your operator as strong as possible, which is unfortunately kind of mandatory for running things like level cap void cascade. No other focus school can really do damage to level cap Frax ghosts, which is a shame. But Madurai is definitely an obvious choice for Dante. Coming on to the companions. The main companion I would say you should use is a Nautilus Prime with a Verglass Prime, and that's because the Verglass Prime is essentially another status beam, right? Dante loves status beams. We're using Galvanized Aptitude here to get more base damage, right? And that is why I told you I have a Torrid config just for Galvanized Aptitude, even though the Torrid itself doesn't really appreciate Galvanized Aptitude very much, because a lot of its damage is not direct damage, a lot of its damage is chaining damage for Torrid. But the thing about these mods, the Galvanized mods, your Sentinel weapons can benefit from them. So this can be a huge multi-shot increase, which is great for beams obviously, and this can be a huge direct damage increase per status type. But even though they can benefit from them, they can't proc them themselves. So every 20 seconds or so, you should get a couple of Torrid kills, and that will allow your Sentinel to benefit from these huge multi-shot and direct damage increases. That might be too much for you, and you might not want to have to remember to use the Torrid once every 20 seconds. I know that's terrible, right? But in that case, you can just use a Serration config, and I do still use Galvanized Chamber, on here, because the alternative is only 10% more multi-shot. And I feel like I'll be using the Torrid always sometimes, or a primary weapon always sometimes, so it's barely a decrease, but in this one, getting no damage, if you were to stop using the Torrid for a while, having no base damage would be a big DPS decrease. So I tend to use this build with Dante and occasionally just get some Torrid kills, and then I have a huge amount of direct damage per status type, and multi-shot being built up. The Rivens aren't necessary, but it is nice to have a Verglass Riven with crit chance, because, of course, without crit chance, you don't get above 50% crit chance. And 50% crit chance is required to proc Tenacious Bond. So, not necessary, but very helpful to have crit chance. Multi-shot is obviously the best stat for status dot beams, as we've discussed, and crit damage is always good. The reason why I recommend the Nautilus Prime is for a few reasons. First of all, he's one of only 2 Sentinels, I believe, that has high enough shields. You need 350 shields or more to be able to permanently get above 1200 for Reinforced Bond. Other Sentinels, say if you want to use Def Q Prime or Diriger or something, they would have to actually engage with this over shields per reloading part, right? Whereas this Sentinel gets 1200 base, so you always have 60% fire rate increase. The second thing is, I do believe Cordon is actually just good for Contagious Bond nukes, right? Because Contagious Bond spreads status within a 9 meter radius. 9 meters isn't a huge radius, so the grouping on Cordon is actually helpful. This room is kind of, this build is kind of stretched very thin in terms of room. You would ideally have room for Manifold Bond as well, like I have on one of these configs, but I do believe this is the best config. For Dante at least, this is the best config. Manifold Bond would be very helpful because it would allow you to cast Cordon, or well, it will allow Nautilus to cast Cordon more often. It would reduce the ability cooldown every time you kill an enemy with 3 or more status procs, but it's just really not possible to fit it in this build. Fired up, this is heat elemental modifier, right? So this allows you to get huge heat inherit situations and for your Verglass to proc more heat. That's kind of a no-brainer, it needs to be here. Animal Instincts you just can't go without, at least I can't. Vacuum you can't, no one can go without. This is just a proc reinforced bond. Assault mode is required for this Sentinel to actually shoot an enemy. Tenacious Bond is crit damage, and Momentous Bond is an elemental damage increase for your Verglass, as well as it helps it revive quicker. You could maybe, if you were to try and remove one mod for Manifold Bond, you could probably try Momentous, but I do believe Momentous Bond is a huge damage increase, because this is actually coded as a separate, so this isn't like adding a elemental mod, this is like adding elemental damage as a bonus to the weapon itself, right? So you won't get weird combined elements. You could get every single element in the game if you kill enough Eximus, and they all apply separately. So you could be doing heat procs and electric procs. They wouldn't combine into radiation from Momentous Bond. If they wouldn't, it wouldn't apply like a mod and make them combine. You could be applying 2 different types of dots, and when that happens, your Verglass gets insanely powerful, obviously. The other options, in my opinion, are the Sunica Kubro, which is just the murder Kubro. I've modded it like this. The mecha set is important, of course. So if you were using the dog, you would definitely swap to a mecha preset, where I've just changed out Growing Power for Mecha Empowered, and I've changed out Energy Nexus for Mecha Pulse. You might ask if the energy economy will be okay taking out Energy Nexus, but I would say so, because in the case you're focusing on your companions so much that you're dedicating 2 mod slots to them, you're probably not doing tragedy nukes as often, so you're spending less energy. You're just mainly applying your abilities, you know, your Page Flight and your Roar to buff up your companion and such. Most of the items on this build are the same. We are using Duplex Bond here. Duplex Bond does have something of a negative synergy with Contagious Bond, because the kills of the clones cannot proc Contagious Bond. But I find that the main target tends to still get the most kills, and a little bit of extra energy does patch up for the loss of Energy Nexus, so I don't think it's too big of a problem having Duplex Bond here. And the claws, in the case of Dante, should be modded like this, but to be honest I don't use the dog very often with Dante, so I just use Shocking Claws most of the time. Also, the benefit of something like Shocking Claws is that you don't have to worry about negative heat inherit situations, right? So if I'm running heat somewhere else on another build that I'm running, I might accidentally negative inherit to the dog, and it wouldn't get this 330% elemental bonus. Whereas with electric, there is no such thing as electric inherit, so electric would always be good. And the last option I occasionally use with Dante is the Panzervorpaphyla with this build. Oh no, with this build actually. All that changes from the main build is I put on Contagious Bond. That's right. Yeah. So we can go without Panzer Devolution, because it's never going to go down because you have Tragedy, right? And I've put Duplex Bond into here and Contagious Bond. You don't have March Symbiosis either, because you're not going to die as Dante. And you'll see, with a fully buffed Dante, even a companion like the Panzervorpaphyla can do quite impressive Contagious Bond nukes. Even though the Panzervorpaphyla is the weakest direct damage companion, it's more about secondary buffing. You'll see that when Dante is in full gear here, that even something like the Panzervorpaphyla can blow up a group of Decadents. Reminder that all these enemies have about a quarter as much health as a level cap Frax, just to showcase the impetus synergy. I remember I haven't actually demonstrated that. You'll see that as my Noctua shoots, this little arcane impetus is going to stack up and up and up to 13. and when it eventually gets to 13 I'll have... we're all dead. When it eventually gets to 13 in a mission, you'll then have 72% strength and 36% ability efficiency, and that's just the best you could ask for from an arcane slot. Another thing that's good, Dante's page flight will allow you to kind of just passively have permanent arcane impetus. As you can see, the timer does go down, 12 seconds, 11 seconds, 10 seconds, but even the page flight slash procs will reapply arcane impetus. So even when you're not shooting and Word Warden is doing anything, the page flight slash procs will count as adding a stack to it, or at least refreshing the timer on it. Try to demonstrate, say, the Nautilus, and I'll actually get some galvanized aptitude stacks first, just so that it can be used to its full effect. It's worth noting that the Torrid does have less heat elemental modifier than the Nautilus, so you can negative heat inherit by firing the Torrid first and then letting the Nautilus do its thing. Oh, I need to reapply my buffs actually. You can see numbers in the hundreds of millions, more than enough to deal with enemies at level cap. Enemies at level cap tend to have a few hundred million EHP at most, and I do believe that's really everything with the build. Just to give you a short gameplay demonstration, there is a fissure on Circulus currently.
Their rage is vehement, their
The ability combination I normally cast first when I load in with this build is 2 then 3, and that disposes you to cast Word Warden, because Word Warden, once that gets going, that will start proccing Archon Stretch for you, and then you'll gain enough energy to cast the rest of your abilities quicker.
Use that reactant to open a relic. Don't forget the reactant. You need more to open that relic. The Orican Neural Sentry is attempting to purge you from this place. Stand by for life support.
I've actually procced Arcane Steadfast right now anyway, so I'll be able to get my full rotation going for quite cheap. So, playing like this first, I'm just going to prime things with the Epitaph and Word Warden and let Nautilus do most of the killing. This is the general lazy way to play. You can see enemies just get blown up by the spreading status damage. I'll finally get Raw going and reapply the rest of the buff. You can do your full rotation and nearly have half your energy. See, 600 million there. Combination of raw double dipping status damage and Word Warden giving you status damage, status chance, vulnerabilities, or just a humongous buff to companion, contagious bond nuke. This really allows you to play very lazily. All I'm doing is walking around and spamming the Epitaph at the floor. I can't stress how important it is that you don't have heat on your Epitaph though, because having heat on your Epitaph will mean that the kill credit is actually your Epitaph, because your Epitaph will be marked as owning that damage over time, right? Because it will, not only does it inherit it, it marks it as the heat status being owned by the Epitaph. If you have heat mods on that Epitaph and you apply it with the Epitaph first. So it's very important not to have it. 11 million, 100 million. So this is the lazy way you can play Dante around level 200 or so content. As you can see, there's no chance of me ever going down. I've got so much overguard. And also Triumph. Triumph gives you an effect where you regenerate overguard in the same way you... Oh, there's damage cap, 2.1 billion. yes, as I was saying, Triumph gives you essentially Arcane Aegis but for Overguard, so you can't actually die during that period at all, as long as you get either a kill or an assist every 2 seconds. You're completely immortal as Dante. And it's very easy for Dante to get kills or assists, as you can see. Casting speed makes the buff rotation very quick. It's not too inconvenient. So yeah, this is the lazy way you can play him with companions. If you want to get a bit more active, you can of course do your own tragedy nukes and blow up rooms yourself. Very fast thanks to the double stacked roll speed mods and Firewalker. See, running around tragedy nuking is not too slow at all with all this casting speed. And the energy situation is fine because of Arcane Steadfast. My raw buff ran out there. I didn't quite blow up those guys.
The sentient is onto you. Look out for troopers.
So you can be quite active like this with tragedy. Blow up rooms. Oh, I just realized everything my Nautilus was doing was actually without Galvanized Aptitude or Galvanized Chamber stacks because I wasn't using the turret. So if I actually use the turret a little bit to get those stacks of Galvanized Aptitude and Galvanized Chamber, then the Nautilus will have an extra 150% multi-shot, as well as actually having base damage.
The longer you hold out, the further I can search. But if you need to leave, extraction is ready.
Enemies like Acolytes are not super impressive for Dante to kill, because of course they have a status cap on them, and Dante is all about dealing damage with huge amounts of status procs. But they still pose no threat to him because he's Dante, and he has Triumph.
Hiding Luna in the void risked the unfathomable. I fear we are seeing the consequences of that risk now. Destroy these void-staring enemies.
Yeah, this is the kind of thing you can expect with a Dante build like this. Casual damage caps from the companion. The rotation you would want to use in a fract, in a Void Cascade mission. You should normally be running to the Exolyzer, and as you're running to the Exolyzer you should, let me just do my buff rotation. As you're running to the Exolyzer, you should pre-cast Tragedy like this, and then when the Exolyzer spawns, you light him up with a ton of status procs. There's no enemy even tough enough here to survive a second of the turret, but you should light him up with status procs from the turret, and then press 4. Release the 4 that you already preemptively stored on him to detonate all those status procs and multiply them by a further, whatever Tragedy's damage multiplier is whenever you apply raw to it. A huge amount. I do believe Dante is probably one of the, if not the strongest frame in the game. There's just no mission where Dante really fails. He's even preferable to His survivability is even preferable to Revenant on occasion. For example, in the Orexia boss fight, she nullifies you a lot, and that of course gets rid of all the Mesmer skin stacks. But you know what doesn't get nullified? The Overguard that Dante has applied. So if I walk into this nullifier bubble, you can see it doesn't get nullified. And that's because the Overguard that Dante applies is actually it's so Triumph is an ability. Like this effect there, you can see that's an effect, but that is just an effect which gives you Overguard regeneration on every kill and assist. Whereas the actual raw Overguard he generates is just applied to your character and is not permanently logged as an ability. So that doesn't get wiped from you whenever you get nullified, or whenever you go out of bounds. You can see my Overguard stays, and that's because it's Overguard that is being applied to you instead of an active effect like Iron Skin. Iron Skin is considered an active effect. That's one negative damage cap there from the companion. Yeah, this Dante loadout is kind of just so powerful that you can just do whatever you want, you know. You can do some tragedy nuking if you want, and let your companion complete the mission for you if you want. And I think that's really everything there is to show. You can see how fast I get to extraction, thanks to the roll speed and double stack roll speed mods and Firewalker combination. Anyway, I hope you found this Dante guide useful, and I hope you learned something, some kind of synergy or tech that you didn't previously know, and that this video has been helpful to you. Thank you for watching.